I remember the exact moment I stopped believing him. It wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no grand revelation under stage lights. Just rain against glass and the way his voice broke on a single word. Please. Jonah had always worn fearlessness like armor. He was the kind of person who walked into rooms like he owned the oxygen, who laughed at things that made other people flinch, who never hesitated before jumping. I'd known him since we were teenagers, back when his confidence felt like gospel truth, back when I thought maybe some people really were born without the weight of doubt pressing against their ribs. I was 22 that night. He was 23. We'd fallen into this rhythm over the years, this easy orbit around each other that never quite had a name. I was the one who listened when his stories got too loud to contain. He was the one who filled silences I didn't know how to break. We never talked about what we were to each other. It felt safer that way. The call came just after midnight. I was already in bed, staring at my phone, not quite ready to surrender the day. His name lit up the screen, and I answered without thinking. He didn't sound like himself. There was something hollow in his voice, something scraped clean of the usual bravado. He said he couldn't sleep. He said he didn't want to be alone. He didn't say please, but I heard it anyway. I drove across town in the dark, watching streetlights blur past my window, wondering what had changed. Jonah didn't ask for things. He took them, or he joked about them, or he pretended not to need them at all. But he didn't ask. His apartment was on the third floor of a building that always smelled faintly of someone else's cooking. I'd been there dozens of times. I knew which stair creaked, knew he never locked the deadbolt, knew the way his living room always looked like he'd just moved in even though he'd been there for 2 years. He opened the door before I could knock. His hair was a mess, like he'd been running his hands through it. He was wearing an old shirt I recognized, one with a faded logo from some concert we'd gone to years ago. He looked at me for a moment without speaking, and I saw something flicker across his face that I couldn't name. Relief, maybe, or fear pretending to be relief. "Come in," he said. "Thanks for coming." I stepped inside. The television was on, muted, casting blue shadows across the walls. Rain had started while I was driving, and now it drummed steadily against the windows, turning the night into something close and intimate. We sat on his couch. He'd pulled up some movie neither of us had seen before, something with subtitles he didn't bother turning on. We weren't really watching. I could feel him beside me, restless in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. He kept shifting, crossing and uncrossing his arms, picking at the edge of a pillow. I didn't push. That wasn't how we worked. Jonah talked when he was ready, and I waited, but the silence stretched longer than usual. It felt different, heavier, like something was pressing against the walls of the room, try to get in. Finally, he spoke. "You ever get scared of being left behind?" The question caught me off guard. I turned to look at him, but he was staring straight ahead at the television, jaw tight, eyes fixed on images he wasn't really seeing. I thought about lying, about saying something easy and deflective, the way we usually did when conversations started drifting toward territory we'd agreed not to explore. But something in his voice stopped me. Sometimes I said, "Yeah." He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer, like maybe he needed to hear it. "Not me," he said. His voice had gone hard, defensive. "I don't get scared." It was such a Jonah thing to say. So perfectly him. The wall going up, the armor sliding back into place. I'd seen him do it 1,000 times. But this time, sitting there in the half-dark with rain, turning the windows into rivers, it didn't sound like confidence. It sounded like a lie he was trying to convince himself of. We sat there for another hour, maybe more. The movie ended. Another one started. Jonah got up once to get water, came back, sat a little closer than before. Close enough that I could feel the heat of him through the space between us. "I should go," I said eventually. It was late. Later than late. The kind of hour where the night starts becoming morning, whether you're ready or not. I stood up. Jonah didn't move. Then his hand shot out, fingers wrapping around my wrist. Not hard, not forceful, but urgent. Desperate in a way that made my breath catch. "Stay." One word. Quiet. Almost whispered. I looked down at him. His hand was shaking. I could feel the tremor of it against my skin, the way his fingers pressed, just a little too tight, like he was afraid I'd disappear if he loosened his grip. "Jonah," I said. What's going on? He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, holding my wrist, staring at the place where his skin touched mine. The rain kept falling. The television kept flickering. And something between us shifted, tectonic and irreversible. Stay, he said again. His voice cracked on the word. Please. And that's when I knew. Jonah wasn't fearless. He never had been. He was terrified. I sank back down onto the couch, and he released my wrist slowly, like he wasn't sure I wouldn't bolt the moment he let go. We sat there in the blue television light, the rain still drumming its endless rhythm against the glass. And for the first time in all the years I'd known him, Jonah looked small. He looked human. He looked afraid. And I realized I had no idea what came next. I stayed because I didn't know how to leave. Not when he looked at me like that. Not when his hand had trembled against my wrist like he was holding on to something he'd already lost. We sat in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that fills rooms and makes them smaller. Jonah leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. I watched his shoulders rise and fall with each breath. Watched the way he kept opening his mouth like he wanted to speak and then closing it again. I'd always been the quiet one. That's what people said about me, anyway. Reese, the listener. Reese, the steady one. The friend who showed up when you called at midnight, who didn't ask too many questions, who let you take up all the space you needed. Jonah was the opposite. He filled rooms without trying. Walked into parties and became the center of them within minutes. Told stories that made people laugh so hard they forgot whatever had been bothering them before he arrived. He was magnetic in a way I never understood, in a way I'd stopped trying to understand years ago. We'd met in high school, back when everything felt both permanent and temporary at the same time. He was a year ahead of me, already building the version of himself he wanted the world to see. Confident, untouchable, the kind of person who made fear look like something other people dealt with. I was drawn to that. I think a lot of people were. But over the years, I'd started noticing things. Small cracks in the performance. The way his laugh sometimes lasted a beat too long. The way he'd change the subject when conversations drifted toward anything real. The way he never, ever admitted to being wrong or scared or uncertain about anything. I used to think it was just who he was. Some people are born sure of themselves, I tell myself. Some people don't carry the same doubts the rest of us do. But sitting there that night, watching him struggle with words he couldn't seem to find, I realized I'd been wrong. Jonah wasn't fearless. He was just better at hiding it than anyone I'd ever met. The rain had gotten harder. It hammered against the windows now, relentless and loud enough to fill the spaces between our breathing. I could smell coffee from earlier, something burnt and forgotten. Could see the mess of his life scattered around the apartment. Books he'd started and abandoned. Clothes draped over chairs. A guitar in the corner he'd bought 2 years ago and never learned to play. Jonah had always been like this. Starting things. Moving on before they required too much of him. I wondered if that's what I was too. Something he'd eventually move on from. He finally spoke, his voice low and rough. You remember freshman year? Well, I climbed that water tower on a dare. I remembered. Everyone remembered. It had become part of the mythology of Jonah, one of the stories people still brought up at gatherings. The night he'd scaled 100 feet of rusted metal in the dark, just because someone said he wouldn't. Yeah, I said. He nodded, still staring at his hands. Everyone thought I did it, because I wasn't scared. Because I was just that guy, you know? The one who'd do anything. He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. I was terrified, he said. The whole time. Every single step. I thought I was going to fall. Thought I was going to die up there, and everyone would find out I wasn't who they thought I was. I didn't say anything. Didn't move. Just let him talk. But I couldn't climb back down, he continued. Because if I did, they'd know. They'd see that I was just like everyone else. Just as scared. Just as small. So I kept going up. His voice had gone quiet, almost a whisper. The television light played across his face, blue and ghostly. I've been doing that ever since, he said. Climbing higher because I'm too scared to come back down. Something in my chest tightened. I'd spent years watching Jonah from the outside, thinking I understood him. Thinking his confidence was real, that his fearlessness was something solid and unshakable. But he'd been performing the whole time, building himself higher and higher, because the alternative was admitting he didn't know how to be anything else. Why are you telling me this? I asked. He turned to look at me, then really look at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Something raw and exposed and so vulnerable it made me want to look away. Because I'm tired, he said. I'm so tired of pretending. The rain kept falling. The night kept pressing against the windows. And Jonah sat there beside me, looking less like the person I'd known for years and more like someone I was only just beginning to meet. Someone real. Someone afraid. Someone who'd finally stopped climbing long enough to realize how high up he'd gone and how alone he'd been the entire time. I need you to understand something, he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. You're the only person who's ever made me want to stop running. And I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to hold something that fragile without breaking it. So I just sat there close enough to feel the heat of him, far enough that I didn't have to face what his words actually meant. Not yet. The call had come at 12:17. I remember because I'd been staring at the clock, watching the minutes change, unable to settle into sleep. When his name appeared on my screen, I didn't hesitate. I never did with Jonah, but that wasn't unusual. We'd fallen into this pattern years ago, this unspoken agreement that we were available to each other at any hour for any reason. He'd show up at my door with takeout at 3 in the morning because he couldn't sleep. I'd text him when I was having a bad day, and he'd send me something stupid that made me laugh despite myself. It worked because neither of us asked what it meant. That night, though, something was different. I heard it in the first syllable of his greeting, in the pause before he spoke, in the way he said my name like he was testing the weight of it. Hey, he'd said. Sorry it's late. It's fine. What's going on? Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear him breathing on the other end, could picture him pacing in that restless way he did when he was trying to sort through thoughts he didn't want to examine too closely. He stopped. Started again. I can't sleep. Could you come over? It wasn't the first time he'd asked, but it was the first time he'd sounded like he needed me to say yes. I'm on my way, I told him. I'd thrown on clothes without thinking, grabbed my keys, and driven through streets that were empty except for the occasional car drifting past like a ghost. The whole drive, I kept trying to figure out what had changed. Jonah didn't sound drunk, didn't sound high, just sounded lost in a way that made my stomach tight with something I didn't want to name. When I arrived, he was waiting. The door opened before I could knock, and there he was, looking like he'd been running his hands through his hair for hours. He tried to smile, that automatic Jonah smile that usually made everything seem lighter, but it didn't reach his eyes. Thanks for coming, he said again as I stepped inside. We'd settled on the couch. He'd turned on some movie, something foreign with subtitles he didn't enable. Neither of us mentioned it. The television was just noise, just light, just something to fill the space while we sat there not saying what we were both thinking. I'd watched him out of the corner of my eye. Watched the way he couldn't sit still, couldn't settle, couldn't seem to figure out what to do with his hands. He picked up the remote, put it down, crossed his arms, uncrossed them, leaned back, leaned forward. I knew Jonah well enough to know he was working up to something. Something he didn't know how to say. So I waited. The rain had started sometime after I arrived, soft at first, then building into something heavier. It turned the windows into percussion, steady and insistent, like the night itself was trying to tell us something. That's when he asked the question, "You ever get scared of being left behind?" It caught me off guard because Jonah didn't ask things like that. Jonah made declarations. Jonah filled silences with stories and laughter and movement. He didn't sit in the dark asking philosophical questions about fear, but there he was asking. And something in his voice told me the question wasn't philosophical at all. Sometimes I'd answered because it was true. Yeah. He nodded like he understood, like maybe he'd been hoping I'd say exactly that. Then he built his wall back up, piece by piece, brick by brick, until he was Jonah again. The Jonah everyone knew. Not me, he'd said. I don't get scared. I'd almost believed him. Almost. Except I'd been watching him for years, learning to read the subtle shifts in his performance, the places where the mask didn't quite fit. We'd sat there through the end of one movie and into the beginning of another. The rain kept falling. The night kept deepening. And gradually, so slowly I almost didn't notice, Jonah moved closer. Not dramatically. Just an inch here, a shift there, until the space between us had narrowed to almost nothing. I could feel the warmth of him, could hear his breathing over the sound of rain and television static, could sense the tension in his body, like he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. When I finally stood to leave, I wasn't even sure what time it was anymore. Late had become later had become the kind of hour where time stops meaning anything at all. I should go, I'd said, and the words felt wrong even as I spoke them. That's when his hand shot out. Fast. Desperate. His fingers wrapped around my wrist and held on like I was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid and uncertain. Stay. One word. But the way he said it stripped away everything else. All the years of performance, all the layers of confidence and bravado and carefully constructed fearlessness. Gone. Just like that. I looked down at him and saw his hand shaking against my skin. Saw the way his jaw was clenched, the way his eyes were too bright, the way he was barely holding himself together. Jonah, I said, what's going on? He didn't answer, just sat there gripping my wrist, staring at the point where we connected like he was trying to memorize it. Stay, he said again, and his voice cracked. Please. That's when I understood. This wasn't about not wanting to be alone. This wasn't about insomnia or restlessness or any of the dozen casual reasons he might have called me over in the past. This was about something bigger, something that terrified him so much he'd finally stopped being able to hide it. I sat back down, slowly, like any sudden movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was happening between us. Jonah released my wrist, but his hand lingered in the air for a moment before falling to his lap. He stared at it like he didn't recognize it, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The television kept playing its forgotten movie. The rain kept its steady rhythm against the glass. And we sat there in the half-light, neither of us speaking, both of us knowing that something had shifted and we couldn't pretend it hadn't. I'd seen Jonah in a lot of states over the years, drunk and laughing at parties where the music was too loud and everyone was trying too hard. Angry after his dad said something cutting over the phone. Tired after long shifts at the job he hated but wouldn't quit. Excited about some new plan that would probably fall apart within a week. But I'd never seen him like this. Small, uncertain, stripped of all the mechanisms he used to take up space in the world. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees again, and his hands started trembling. Not a lot, just enough that I could see it in the blue television glow, enough that I knew he was aware of it too and hating himself for it. I wanted to reach out, to put my hand on his shoulder or his back, or anywhere that might offer some kind of comfort. But I didn't know if that would help or make things worse. Didn't know if touch would ground him or send him running back behind his walls. So I just sat there, close enough that he'd know I wasn't leaving, far enough that he had room to breathe. The silence stretched, seconds into minutes, the kind of quiet that would have been unbearable with anyone else. But with Jonah, I'd learned to wait, to let him come to things in his own time, even when his own time felt impossibly slow. Finally, he spoke. His voice came out rough, like he'd been swallowing something sharp. I say I'm not scared because if I start admitting things, I won't know where to stop. The words hung in the air between us. Heavy. True. The kind of truth that costs something to speak out loud. I didn't respond right away. Just let the statement exist. Let it settle. Let him hear his own confession echoing in the small apartment. What are you afraid of admitting? I asked eventually, quietly. He shook his head, a small motion, almost imperceptible. Everything. Nothing. I don't know. But he did know. I could see it in the way his shoulders curved inward, in the way he couldn't look at me, in the way his hands kept shaking no matter how hard he tried to still them. Jonah had built his entire identity on being the fearless one. The one who jumped first and figured out the landing later. The one who laughed at consequences and treated caution like a character flaw. Admitting fear would mean dismantling all of that. Admitting fear would mean starting over from nothing. And maybe that's what terrified him most. Not the fear itself, but what acknowledging it would require him to become. I thought about all the times I'd watched him perform. All the parties where he'd been the loudest voice, the brightest presence, the one everyone gravitated toward. All the times he'd told stories that made him sound invincible. All the times he deflected anything real with a joke or a change of subject or a sudden decision to leave. I'd admired it once, that ability to move through the world like nothing could touch him. But sitting there in the dark, watching him come apart in slow motion, I realized how exhausting it must have been. How lonely. To never let anyone see the parts of you that weren't shining. To never admit that sometimes you didn't know what you were doing. To never ask for help because asking would mean confessing you needed it. Without thinking, I reached out. Slowly, carefully, I rested my hand over his, covering the trembling with my own steadiness. He went completely still, like he'd stopped breathing, like the entire world had paused to see what would happen next. I didn't move, didn't pull away, just kept my hand there, warm and solid and present. And gradually, degree by degree, I felt him relax. Felt the tension start to drain from his shoulders, felt his breathing even out, felt his hand turn under mine until our palms were pressed together. He still didn't look at me, but his fingers curled around mine, holding on, and that felt like more honesty than any words could have carried. We sat like that for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. Tom had stopped meaning anything concrete. There was just the rain and the television light and the warmth of his hand in mine and the feeling that we'd crossed some invisible line we could never uncross. I thought about all the years we'd spent circling around each other, all the almost moments we'd let pass, all the things we'd never said because saying them would have meant risking this, whatever this was. This friendship that had always felt like more than friendship, but less than anything we could name. Jonah's thumb moved against the back of my hand. A small gesture, barely there, but intentional, and I realized he wasn't just holding on because he was scared. He was holding on because he'd finally stopped pretending he didn't want to. The performance was over. The fearless version of Jonah had left the building. And what remained was this, someone real and frightened and honest, someone who'd finally run out of places to hide, someone who'd chosen to stop hiding from me. The rain had started to soften, not stopping, but losing its urgency, settling into something gentler. Background noise instead of percussion. Jonah's hand was still in mine. Our fingers had intertwined at some point, though I couldn't remember when. It felt natural, like maybe our hands had always been meant to fit together this way, and we'd just been too afraid to find out. He was staring at the place where we connected, his expression unreadable. I watched him watching us, watched the way his jaw worked like he was trying to figure out what to say, watched the way his breathing had gone shallow and careful. I knew what was coming, could feel it building in the space between us, in the way the air had gotten heavier, in the way this moment felt both inevitable and terrifying. Say it, I thought. Whatever it is, just say it. But I didn't speak, didn't push, just waited, the way I'd always waited with him. His thumb traced small circles against my palm. Nervous, deliberate, like he was working up courage through repetition, through the simple act of touch. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the rain. You leaving feels like the end of something I can't name. The words landed between us, soft and devastating. I felt my throat tighten, felt something crack open in my chest that I'd been keeping carefully locked away for longer than I wanted to admit. Because I knew what he meant. Had always known, maybe on some level I'd refused to examine too closely. Every time I left his apartment, every time I went home after one of our long nights, every time I said goodbye, there was this feeling, this ache, this sense that I was walking away from something important, something that mattered more than either of us was willing to acknowledge. I'd learned to ignore it, to tell myself it was normal, that everyone felt this way about their closest friends, that the hollow feeling in my chest when I drove home was just tiredness or loneliness or anything other than what it actually was. But Jonah had just named it, had pulled it into the light where we couldn't pretend it didn't exist anymore. Then say what it is, I heard myself say. My voice came out steadier than I felt. He looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I saw everything in his eyes that he'd been hiding, everything he'd been too scared to let me see. Years of it, all the almost moments and swallowed words and careful distance he'd maintained to keep us both safe. Safe from this, from the truth that would change everything. His eyes were wet. I'd never seen Jonah cry. Hadn't known he could. He'd always been the one who laughed through pain, who deflected with humor, who turned everything into a story where he came out unscathed. But there were tears now, gathering at the edges of his eyes, threatening to fall. "You," he whispered. "It's you. You're what I'm scared of losing." The confession hung in the air like something physical, like something I could reach out and touch if I wanted to, like something that would shatter if either of us breathed wrong. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, felt the weight of what he'd just admitted pressing down on both of us, felt the world narrow until there was nothing but this room, this couch, this moment, his hand in mine, and the truth finally spoken out loud. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you known?" He shook his head slightly. "I don't know. Maybe always. Maybe the whole time." His voice cracked on the last word, and a tear finally escaped, sliding down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Just let it fall. "I thought I could handle it," he continued. "Thought I could just keep you in my life as my friend, and that would be enough. Thought I could be around you and not want more. Thought I could watch you leave every night and be okay with it." He paused, his breathing uneven. "But I can't. I can't anymore. Every time you walk out that door, I feel like I'm losing something I never actually had. And I'm so tired of pretending it doesn't hurt." The rawness in his voice undid something in me. All the careful control I'd maintained, all the walls I'd built around my own feelings, all the times I'd told myself that what I felt for Jonah was just friendship, just closeness, just the bond that comes from knowing someone for years. All of it collapsed. Because he was right. He'd named the thing I'd been refusing to name. The feeling that had been growing in the spaces between our conversations, in the silences we shared, in the way I always answered when he called no matter what time it was. It wasn't just friendship. It had never been just friendship. I'd been lying to myself just as much as he'd been lying to himself. We'd both been performing, both pretending, both too scared to admit what was happening between us. Until now. Until this moment when the rain drummed softly against the windows and Jonah sat beside me with tears on his face and his hand in mine, and the truth finally spoken between us. "You're not losing me," I said quietly. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, desperate and hopeful and terrified all at once. "You're not losing me," I said again, "because I'm already yours. I have been for a long time." And watching his face break open with relief and fear and something that looked like joy, I realized I'd been just as scared as him. Scared of this. Scared of us. Scared of what it would mean to stop pretending and start being honest. But the fear didn't matter anymore. Not compared to this. Not compared to him. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just sat there, his hand still in mine, the confession hanging between us like something sacred and terrifying. I'd said it out loud. "I'm already yours." Words I couldn't take back. Words that changed the shape of everything we'd been to each other. Words that made real what we'd both been pretending didn't exist. Jonah's breath caught. I heard it, saw the way his chest hitched, saw another tear slide down his face. But this time there was something else in his expression. Something that looked like relief breaking through the fear. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Shook his head like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. I couldn't stay sitting anymore. The distance between us, even though it was barely there, felt like too much. I shifted, moving closer, and then I was kneeling on the floor in front of him, eye level, close enough to see the exact shade of vulnerability in his expression. Close enough that there was nowhere left to hide. "Then stop pretending you're not scared," I said softly. His eyes met mine and held. Searching, looking for something. Maybe looking for permission. Maybe looking for certainty in a moment that felt anything but certain. "I don't know how to do that," he whispered. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've been." "You don't have to know," I told him. "You just have to try." His hand came up, hesitant, trembling slightly as it reached toward my face. His fingers brushed against my jaw, tentative, like he was afraid I might disappear if he touched me too directly. Like this was all some dream he was going to wake up from. I stayed perfectly still. Let him touch me. Let him trace the line of my cheekbone with his thumb. Let him learn the reality of this moment through his fingertips. "I'm terrified," he said. His voice was barely there, barely more than breath. "I know. Of this. Of us. Of what happens next. I know. Of losing you." "You won't," I said. I meant it. I brought my hand up to cover his where it rested against my face. "You won't lose me." "How do you know?" The question was raw, desperate. How can you be sure? I can't, I admitted. But I'm here anyway. Something shifted in his expression. The fear was still there, would probably always be there in some form, but underneath it now was something else. Something that looked like acceptance. Like maybe he was finally ready to stop running from this. From us. He leaned forward slowly, giving me time to pull away, time to change my mind, time to take back everything I just said. But I didn't move. Didn't want to. I'd spent too many years not moving toward him to waste this moment, moving away. When he rested his forehead against mine, I felt him exhale. Felt the tension drain from his shoulders. Felt him finally stop fighting. We stayed like that, breathing the same air. Close enough that I could count his heartbeats. Close enough that there was no space left between us for pretending or performance or any of the careful distance we'd maintained for years. I'm not leaving, I whispered against his skin. He made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. His arms came around me then, wrapping tight, pulling me closer until I was no longer kneeling but pressed against him, tangled together on the couch in a way that made it impossible to tell where I ended and he began. He held on like I was the only thing keeping him anchored. Like letting go would mean drifting away into something he couldn't come back from. I'm not leaving, I said again, and I felt him nod against my shoulder. Okay, he breathed. Okay. His whole body was shaking now. Not from fear exactly, but from relief. From the weight of finally letting go of something he'd been carrying alone for too long. From the sheer exhaustion of years spent pretending to be fearless when what he really was just human. Just someone who wanted to be loved and was terrified of admitting it. I held him while he shook, while he cried into my shoulder, while the rain continued its soft percussion against the windows and the television played its forgotten movie and the night stretched on around us. I held him and thought about all the times we'd almost gotten here. All the moments that had felt charged with possibility, but had passed without either of us being brave enough to reach for them. All the nights I'd driven home feeling like I'd left part of myself behind at his apartment. We'd wasted so much time. Both of us too scared to risk what we had for what we might have. Both of us choosing safety over truth. But we were here now, finally, messily, with tears and trembling hands and confessions pulled from places we tried to keep hidden. We were here, and when Jonah finally pulled back enough to look at me, his eyes were red but clear. The performance was gone. The mask had fallen away completely. What was left was just him, real and afraid and honest, beautiful in a way I'd never let myself see before. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For staying. For not running when I told you the truth. I reached up, brushed away the dampness from his cheeks with my thumb. You called me, remember? At midnight. Asked me to come over. He nodded. I came, I said simply, and I'm still here. That's not going to change just because you finally told me what we've both been feeling. He closed his eyes, leaned into my touch. And for the first time since I'd known him, Jonah looked peaceful. Like he'd finally come down from that water tower he'd been climbing all these years. Like he'd finally found solid ground. That was 3 weeks ago. Sometimes it feels like 3 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Jonah still tells his stories at parties. Still laughs too loud. Still walks into rooms like he owns them. The performance hasn't disappeared completely, and I don't think it ever will. It's part of who he is, woven into the fabric of how he moves through the world. But there are differences now, small ones that probably no one else notices. The way his eyes find mine across crowded rooms, seeking confirmation that I'm still there. The way he doesn't stay out as late as he used to, like he's finally found a reason to come home. The way he'll pause mid-story sometimes, just for a second, like he's checking to make sure he's still being honest. We haven't told anyone yet. Not because we're hiding exactly, but because we're still figuring out what this is. What we are. How to be us in a way that feels real instead of performed. Some nights he stays at my place. Some nights I stay at his. We've fallen into this easy rhythm, this unspoken understanding that neither of us wants to sleep alone anymore. That we spent enough years pretending distance was safer. He still gets restless sometimes. I'll wake up at 2 in the morning and find him standing by the window, staring out at the city, hands shoved in his pockets. The The first time it happened, I asked if he was okay. He nodded but didn't move. Didn't come back to bed, so I got up and stood beside him. Didn't say anything. Just stood there until he reached for my hand without looking at me, until his fingers laced through mine the way they had that rainy night on his couch. We stood like that for 20 minutes, maybe longer, until whatever was chasing him through his thoughts finally let him go. He doesn't always talk about what scares him. Sometimes I think he's still learning the language for it, still figuring out how to name things he spent so long refusing to acknowledge. But he's trying. That's what matters. Last week, we were lying in bed, that quiet hour just before sleep when everything feels a little more honest. The lights were off. I could feel his breathing beside me, steady and warm. I used to think brave meant not being afraid. He said into the darkness. His voice was soft, contemplative, not performing, just thinking out loud. What do you think it means now? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I think it means being afraid and doing it anyway. Feeling the fear and not letting it make your choices for you. I turned toward him, though I could barely see him in the dark. That sounds like something you read on a motivational poster. He laughed, and I felt his hand find mine under the covers. Maybe, but it's true anyway. You're not who you were, I said. You know that, right? He didn't answer right away. I waited, giving him space to think. I'm trying not to be, he finally said. Try to be someone who doesn't have to pretend all the time. You don't have to pretend with me. I know. His thumb traced circles against my palm, that same nervous gesture from that first night. That's what scares me. What do you mean? If I'm not pretending with you, then you see all of me. The parts that aren't brave or confident or fearless. The parts that are just scared and small and don't know what they're doing. I squeezed his hand. Those are the parts one wants to see, even when they're not good. Especially then. He shifted closer in the darkness until his forehead rested against my shoulder. Why? Because they're real, I said simply. Because they're you. He was quiet after that, but his grip on my hand tightened, and I knew he'd heard me. Knew that somewhere underneath all his years of performance and pretending, the truth was taking root. The next morning, I woke up to find him already awake, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. What? I asked, my voice still rough with sleep. Nothing. He smiled, and it was his real smile, not the one he used for everyone else. I'm just glad you're here. Where else would I be? I don't know, but I spent a long time thinking you'd eventually leave. I'm not going anywhere. He nodded, like maybe he was finally starting to believe it. Good, because I'm not letting you. It's not dramatic what we have. There's no grand declaration, no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. We're just two people who were afraid of the same thing, who finally got brave enough to stop running from it. Some nights, when the world gets quiet, Jonah still reaches for me without a word. Still holds on a little too tight, like he's making sure I'm real. And I let him, because I understand now what he was so afraid of losing. Not just me, but the version of himself he gets to be when I'm around. The one who doesn't have to climb higher to prove something. The one who can admit he's scared and still be loved anyway. He doesn't say he isn't afraid anymore. That particular performance has ended. Instead, he reaches for my hand in the dark. He stays. He lets me stay. And somehow, that honesty is braver than fearlessness ever was. Sometimes I think about that rainy night. The way his voice broke on a single word. Please. The way his hand shook against my wrist. The way he finally stopped pretending long enough to tell me the truth. I think about how close we came to missing this. To letting fear make our choices for us. But we didn't. We chose each other instead. And every night when he reaches for me, when his fingers find mine in the darkness, when he holds on like I'm something worth keeping, I know we made the right choice. Both of us. Finally brave enough to be afraid together.